Hey there, I'm Dan Chambers, and this is 10-Minute Bible Bites, the vidcast that unpacks God's Word 10 minutes at a time. And we are unpacking Matthew chapter 24, one of the most misunderstood chapters in all the New Testament. And this is episode number 11. And we're going to pick up our study where we left off. That would be at verse 31. But before we do that, there's something about verse 30 that I'd like to add. Now, we talked about that verse, and I suggested that the best way to understand it contextually, and this is grammatically possible, we saw that through the American Standard Version, that when God judges the temple, destroys the temple, it is going to be a sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. There's an allusion there to Daniel chapter 7 where he is given all dominion. It's going to be a sign. It's going to vindicate Jesus before his enemies. He is coming in judgment. That's the imagery of him coming on the clouds. And they're going to see him coming on the clouds. Now, it's that seeing the coming of the Son of Man. There's another verse that we need to look at real quick. It's Matthew chapter 16. It's something Jesus says just a few chapters earlier. Now, this is one that you really need to write down in the margin here. You need to just kind of bracket or put parentheses or something, circle it, underline, that they'll see the Son of Man coming. And beside that, or somewhere on your page, you need to put Matthew chapter 16, verse 28. So I'm going to flip over to Matthew chapter 16, verse 28. I hope you're flipping with me. Matthew chapter 16 and verse 28. And listen to this statement that Jesus makes. He says, "Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." Now that's the same language. And Jesus is saying earlier, look, some of you, he's talking to his contemporaries, some of you standing here, you're not going to see death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Now, what's that talking about? Well, he's saying that there's something that's going to take place during that generation, people who are standing there, that is going to be a manifestation of Jesus' kingly presence till they see Jesus coming in his kingdom. There's going to be something that is going to be a visible sign that Jesus is who he claims to be. He is the King of Kings. Now, what is that? Well, he doesn't say in verse 28 of Matthew chapter 16. It could be, some suggest, his resurrection. That certainly was a manifestation of his kingly presence. Some suggest that's the day of Pentecost. That certainly is true. And others suggest that it's probably a reference to the destruction of the temple. And that could be true as well. Because here in, again, verse 30, he is saying they're going to see, when the temple is destroyed, the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. It is going to be a manifestation that he reigns in heaven. Okay, let's take a look at verse 31 now. "And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other." You know, that really does sound like second coming language, because, of course, there's other passages that we could take a look at. I'm not going to take the time to do that. But when we read about Jesus coming with his angels, and he's going to be dealing out retribution to those who don't know God, those who don't obey the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we know that angels are going to accompany the second coming of Jesus. And so it kind of sounds like that. But again, we have to understand the context, and we have to embrace the concept or the context rather. And so, again, this is talking about things that happened during the generation of Jesus that's tied to the destruction of the temple. Okay, so what really is verse 31 all about? Well, when Jerusalem falls and when the temple falls, it's going to be a signal. And that signal is that it's going to be a turning point in the mission of the church. What's going to happen at that moment when it's going to be a sign that the mission of the church is worldwide in its scope. That God is going to go throughout the world, and he is calling everyone into the kingdom, everyone to recognize that Jesus Christ is the King, and to enter his kingdom and to submit to his sovereign rule. Now, the only thing here, and I mean, read it, that It's what it sounds like. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect, his people, from the four winds. The imagery of the four winds is from all over the earth, from the four winds and from one end of the sky to the other. Imagery of universal collection. The angels are going to collect all of God's people from all over the earth. The only stumbling block there for that we really have to deal with is the word angels. And I think that's kind of the word that just naturally throws people off. We need to understand something about the word angels. That word is a word that can just refer to any messenger of, and let me show you. Here's a couple of things. I've circled the word angel in the Bible. I've drawn a little line into the marginal note, and that's what I've written. I've written can refer to messengers, and I've written this reference down, 11:10. That is chapter 11, verse 10. And when I just say 11:10, since I don't have a book in front of it, it means the book that I'm in. So Matthew 11:10. And so when we turn over to Matthew chapter 11:10, here's what we read. This is Jesus paying tribute to John the Baptist. This is the one about whom it is written, "Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you." Do you know what the word there, the actual Greek word that Matthew uses that's translated messenger? It's the same word as angel. The word angel can mean messenger. So it's just a word, whether it's actually a supernatural spirit person angel, or whether it is a human being messenger from God, John the Baptist. The same word is used. Context has to determine whether it's messenger or whether it's an angel. Let's take a look. There's some other places where we can see that as well. Turn over to the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. And this is, again, another text citation that I have written down, jotted down there beside verse 31 in Matthew chapter 24. So Luke chapter 7, look at verse 24. Luke chapter 7, get down to verse 24. When the messengers of John had left, he began to speak to the crowds about John. When the messengers of John, I'm sure you know by now what that word messenger is. It's the same word for angels. Look down in verse 27. Again, Jesus says, "This is the one about whom it is written, Behold, I will send my messenger." We just saw Matthew say that in verse 11. Turn over to chapter 9, Luke chapter 9. Look at verse 52. Luke chapter 9, we get over to verse 52, and it says, "And he sent messengers on ahead of him, and they went and entered the village of the Samaritans to make arrangement for him." They sent messengers. That word, that is the word for angels. And so there's several places in the New Testament where that word is used. And again, we have to determine by context whether it means a human messenger or whether it means an angelic messenger. And so with that in mind, and there's some other verses that we could look at, but we won't take the time to do that. I think you get the picture. When we go back to verse 31, I think it's best to understand it again contextually. The word angels as messengers. And he will send forth his messengers with a great trumpet, and they'll gather together the elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Again, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, as I said at the beginning of our study together here in this episode, that Jerusalem's fall signals a change in the mission of the church. It's a turning point. Now God's people are going to go throughout all of the world, and they're going to bring people into the kingdom. It's really the foreshadowing of the Great Commission that we're going to read about, of course, in Matthew chapter 28. So let's sum it up real quickly in the 30 seconds that we've got left. Verses 29 through 31. I know it sounds like to modern ears that it's a description of the second coming and the end of the age. But it can't be that because they are explicitly dated to that generation, and they are connected in verse 29 with the words tribulation of those days. This is simply a reference to the destruction, the climactic event of the Romans coming to Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem is going to climax in the destruction of the temple. It's the language of God's judgment in verse 29, Old Testament metaphorical language of judgment. Verse 30 simply tells us that when this happens, it's going to be a sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. He's going to be vindicated before his enemies that he is the Christ. It's going to be a visible manifestation that people see that He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And that's going to change the mission of His people. It's going to be a worldwide mission as His messengers are sent to all of the world to bring people into the kingdom. All right. Thanks for joining me in this Bible study. I hope to see you next time as we continue to unpack Matthew 24 in 10-minute Bible bites. Thanks.